In the autumn of 2011, in a quiet steel city called Ardenmoor, a young bride named Colette Vane walked into a hotel bridal suite the night before her wedding and never walked out. The room was untouched. Her dress still hung on the closet door. Her keys, her phone, her packed honeymoon bag, all of it left exactly where she set it down. Police found no forced entry, no struggle, no trace of where she went. The case quickly went cold, and the city decided she had simply run away. 14 years later, one small detail on a forgotten VHS tape reopened everything and revealed a truth no one was prepared for, because the answer had been sitting on a shelf, in plain sight, the entire time. If stories like this matter to you, the ones the world gave up on, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling them. Now, let's get into today's case. Ardenmoor was the kind of city that used to make things. Rolling mills, a river the color of weak tea, rows of brick houses built for men who worked with their hands. By 2011, the mills were mostly quiet. But the city still had its rhythms: high school football on Fridays, church on Sundays, and a wedding season that ran from May to the first hard frost. Marcus Deal filmed those weddings. He was 41 that year, a soft-spoken man with a graying beard and a camcorder that felt like an extension of his own arm. He ran a one-man business out of a storefront on Delancey Street. Deal Video Productions, the sign said. Gold letters on a green field. He shot weddings, quinceañeras, the occasional retirement party. He was good at his job in a way people rarely noticed, which is to say he was invisible. A good wedding videographer disappears into the wallpaper. He catches the moments no one knows are happening. Marcus had a habit of arriving early. 2 hours early, sometimes 3. He liked to test his light, walk the rooms, learn where the reflections lived. He kept his tapes labeled in his own tight handwriting and filed them on steel shelves in the back of the shop, alphabetized by the bride's last name. He never threw a tape away. "You don't know what a family will want back in 20 years, he'd say. "That's the whole job. You're not filming today. You're filming the day they'll need it." He'd been hired to film the Vane Aldous wedding. Colette Vane was 26. She taught 4th grade at Ardenmoor Elementary, the kind of teacher whose students cried on the last day of school. She had a laugh that arrived before the joke landed, and a habit of touching your arm when she talked to you, like she was making sure you were really there. She wore her dark hair in a loose braid that came undone by lunchtime, and she kept a paperback in her bag at all times. Mysteries, mostly the fat paperback kind with cracked spines she bought 3 for $1 at the library sale. Her classroom smelled like tangerines and dry erase markers. She kept a jar of buttons on her desk that the kids weren't allowed to touch but always did, and she never once told them to stop. People described her the same way over and over in the years that came after. Warm, present, unforgettable. Her students, grown now, still remembered the way she read aloud, doing all the voices, refusing to skip the boring parts, telling them that the boring parts were where you learned who a person really was. She was the teacher who noticed the kid at the edge of the room. She'd been that kid once herself. She was marrying Julian Aldous, a regional sales manager for a medical supply company. He was 31, handsome in a magazine sort of way, with a firm handshake and a laugh that came a beat too late. He drove a leased sedan he kept immaculate, and wore a watch that cost more than Colette's car. Everyone said what a lovely couple they made. He brought her mother flowers and remembered names and knew which fork to use. On paper, he was flawless. Marcus met him twice before the wedding and couldn't have told you a single true thing about him. Julian was polished. Julian was pleasant. Julian answered every question with the answer you'd want, delivered a half-second too smoothly, like a man who'd anticipated the test. At the planning meeting, he'd talked about the wedding as an event to be managed, rather than a day to be lived. He'd corrected Colette twice, gently, in front of Marcus's small things, the color of the linens, the order of the toasts, and both times she'd let it go with a little laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. Julian felt, Marcus thought later, like a man reading lines he'd rehearsed alone. In a mirror. There was nothing you could point to. There was just a coldness under the warmth. The way a nice house can have a draft you can't find the source of. But that was later. At the time, it was just a job, and plenty of grooms were stiff on camera. And it wasn't Marcus's business who anyone married. The person who loved Colette most in the world wasn't at the center of this story for a long time. And that's part of what went wrong. Her older brother, Ronan, lived 4 states away. An oil rig welder who came home twice a year with sunburn on the back of his neck. And grease he could never quite get out from under his nails. He was 6 years older and had half raised her after their father left. And there had never been a day in his life he wouldn't have stepped in front of a truck for her. He and Colette talked every Sunday night on the phone. A ritual that had survived their whole adult lives. 9 o'clock her time, whatever time it happened to be, wherever he was. They talked about nothing mostly. That was the point. He would remember, for the rest of his life, that their last real conversation had been about nothing at all. A movie she'd seen, a chili recipe she wanted him to try, whether he'd finally get around to fixing the truck he'd been threatening to fix for 3 years. He'd asked, near the end, if she was sure about Julian. Not because he had a reason, just because he was her brother and it was the night before, and that was the kind of thing you asked. There'd been a pause on the line, a half-second longer than it should have been. Then she'd said, "Of course I'm sure," and laughed and changed the subject. He'd remember that pause for 14 years. He'd spend all of them trying to decide what it meant. The wedding was set for a Saturday in mid-October. The night before, Colette checked into the Rushmont Hotel, the grand old building downtown, the one with the marble lobby and the elevator that still needed an operator on busy nights. Tradition, she'd said. She didn't want Julian to see her before the ceremony. She wanted one last night as just herself. Marcus was there that Friday evening, too. The bride had asked him to film the getting ready footage the next morning, but she'd also asked, almost shyly over the phone, if he'd shoot a few minutes the night before her and her bridesmaids, the dress, the room. "Something to remember the waiting by," she'd said. "The morning will be such a rush. I want to remember the quiet part." So he came. The Rushmont bridal suite was on the 4th floor, a corner room with tall windows and heavy drapes the color of old wine. It had the faded grandeur the whole hotel wore good bones, a little threadbare, the kind of place that had been elegant when the mills were running and had been coasting on the memory ever since. The wallpaper was cream with a gold fleur-de-lis pattern. There was a chaise no one ever sat on, and a gilt-framed mirror on the far wall, large as a doorway, that Marcus registered the way you register furniture. Not at all. He filmed for maybe 40 minutes. Colette and 3 friends, Dana, Priya, and a cousin named Beth, a bottle of cheap champagne they kept refilling. The dress on its padded hanger catching the lamplight and throwing it back soft and white. The women were happy in the loose, tired way of people at the end of a long, good day. Somebody had brought a portable speaker. Somebody had already cried, once, from happiness and been teased for it. Colette sat cross-legged on the floor in an old college sweatshirt, her braid coming apart, her feet bare. And she looked less like a bride than like a girl at a sleepover. She kept catching Marcus's lens and making a face at it. At one point, she took the camera from him and turned it around and filmed him for a minute. narrating in a mock-serious voice. And here we have the elusive wedding videographer in his natural habitat. Until he laughed and took it back. He remembered her being happy. For 14 years, that was the whole of what he remembered. A happy girl on a happy night. He did not remember because he was not looking, because no one was looking, because the camera on his shoulder was the only thing in the room seeing everything at once, that at one point in the evening, Colette's eyes went, just for a moment, to the far wall, to the connecting door beside the big gilt mirror, and that her face did something complicated and quick before she smiled again and refilled a glass. He packed up around 9, wished her luck, told her he'd see her at 8 in the morning. She hugged him at the door, which brides didn't usually do, and thanked him for coming out on a Friday night. "You're going to make us look better than we deserve," she said. "You'll look exactly as good as you are," he said, and meant it, and left. He drove home through the first cold rain of the season, wipers on, the heater ticking, the radio low. He remembered thinking it was going to be a beautiful wedding. That was the last footage anyone ever shot of Colette Vane alive. Something felt wrong the next morning, really wrong. The bridesmaids arrived at 9 to help her dress, arms full of garment bags and coffee and a curling iron. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again, laughing at first she's still asleep. The bride overslept her own wedding. Oh, she's going to kill herself. And then, when the third knock brought nothing, and the fourth brought nothing, and Dana pressed her ear to the door and heard only the hum of the hall, not laughing at all. They called her phone. Somewhere inside the room, faintly, it rang. And rang. And went to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Colette. Leave it and I'll call you back." And the sound of her voice through the door, cheerful and ordinary, was the moment the morning tilted. The front desk sent up a manager with a key. The room was undisturbed. That was the word everyone used, then and after, because there was no better one. Undisturbed. The dress hung where it had hung the night before, on the padded hanger, on the closet door, still in its plastic sleeve at the shoulders. The bed was made not slept in, or made so perfectly it might as well not have been. The corners tucked, the pillows squared. Her phone sat on the nightstand. Screen dark, 41 missed calls it would never answer. The little envelope icon stacked with voicemails from women standing 10 feet away. Her honeymoon bag stood zipped by the door, packed the way she packed, rolled clothes and a Ziploc of toiletries and the paperback for the plane. Her keys were in the little glass dish by the lamp. Her purse was on the chaise, her wallet inside it, her cash and cards untouched. Her shoes, both pairs, the flats she'd worn Friday and the heels for the ceremony, were lined up beneath the window, toes to the wall, the way you'd leave them if you meant to be back in the morning. Colette was gone. There was no note, no sign of a struggle, no overturned lamp, no scuff on the carpet, no torn fabric, nothing. The window was locked from the inside, the old brass latch thrown, 4 stories up over a service alley. The door had been locked too, deadbolt and chain both, except the chain, oddly, was not set. And the manager's key was the first thing to turn that lock all morning. The bathroom was dry, the towels were folded. The complimentary soap was unwrapped but unused. And the champagne glasses from the night before had been washed and set upside down on a folded towel by the sink to dry the way Colette always left glasses. A small, tidy habit her brother would later confirm, sitting very still in a police station. When they asked him if there was anything at all, that seemed like her. He'd said yes, the glasses. She always did that, rinse them and turn them over so they wouldn't spot. He didn't know yet that it hadn't been Colette who washed them. It would be years before he understood that the one detail that felt most like his sister was the one that proved she was already gone. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. A woman does not evaporate from a locked room on the highest night of her life. She does not leave her phone, her keys, her shoes. She does not leave her dress. By noon, the wedding guests were being turned away at the church. By evening, the police had opened a missing persons case. By the following week, half of Ardenmore had decided they knew exactly what had happened. She'd run. The detective assigned to the case was a man named Alton Reyes. 3 years from his pension, and tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. He'd seen enough runaway brides to fill a filing cabinet, and he approached Colette's disappearance the way he approached all of them, with sympathy for the family and quiet certainty about the ending. But the room bothered him. He walked it 4 times. He couldn't work out how she'd left. The locked window, the locked door, the untouched bag. If she'd run with nothing, no money, no phone, no clothes, but the ones on her back. Runaways took something. They always took something. Colette had taken air. The dogs came Sunday. 2 K9 units, handlers and windbreakers against the drizzle. A pair of German shepherds named Boone and Kit. They started in the room, working the carpet, the bed, the closet. The dogs caught Colette's scent immediately, strong and clear, the handlers said. A fresh, well-defined trail. Nothing degraded about it. They followed it out the door, down the hall, not to the elevator, not to the main stairs, but to the door marked Staff Only at the end of the corridor. Down the service stairs, 4 flights, the dogs sure and quick. Through the ground floor kitchen, past the walk-in coolers and the dish pit, out the loading entrance into the alley behind the hotel, where the delivery trucks came and the dumpsters stood in a row against the brick. And then, at the mouth of the alley, the scent stopped. Not faded, not scattered into the traffic in the rain of Saturday morning. Stopped. Both dogs circled the same 6 feet of wet pavement, noses down, and then sat, confused, looking back at their handlers as if to ask where the rest of it went. One of the handlers, a woman named Perez, who'd worked scent for 11 years, said she'd never seen a trail end so cleanly in her life. A trail ended like that, she told Reyes, when the subject got into a vehicle or when they were picked up and carried, so their feet stopped touching the ground and stopped laying down scent. Reyes wrote both possibilities in his notebook. A vehicle made sense. There'd been no camera on the alley to prove or disprove it. The other possibility carried he underlined once and didn't know what to do with. Who carries a grown woman out of a hotel? And why would she have walked on her own scent trail, down 4 flights of service stairs in the middle of the night, only to be carried the last 20 feet? It didn't make sense. It just didn't. It was the one baffling clue in a case that otherwise offered nothing at all. And it sat in Reyes's chest like a swallowed stone for the rest of his career. They searched the river with grappling hooks and a dive team. They searched the rail yard and the culverts and the woods along the highway. They ran her face on the news, 3 states wide. Nothing. They pulled Julian in and questioned him for 6 hours. He cried real tears, the detective thought, or a very good performance of them. And his alibi held like poured concrete. He'd been at his own bachelor gathering across town, a private room at a steakhouse, a dozen men who could place him there from 8 until past 2 in the morning, plus the valet, plus the credit card receipts. Whatever else Julian Aldous was, he had not been at the Rushmont that night. Reyes let him go and privately crossed him off. and privately never fully trusted the crossing off, because the husband is always the answer, except in the cases where he isn't. And those are the ones that ruin you. They questioned the bridesmaids, who'd left the suite together at 10 and gone to their own rooms 2 floors down, and who all swore Colette had been fine tired, a little wistful, but fine, laughing, ready. They questioned the hotel staff, the front desk, the night manager, the housekeeping crew. A housekeeping supervisor named Harriet Sable, 68, 30 years on the job, told the officer who interviewed her that she'd worked until 11 and gone home and seen nothing unusual. She was steady and helpful and utterly unremarkable, and the officer thanked her and moved on. Nobody wrote her name down twice. They pulled every tape from every camera in the building, back when the Rushmonts still recorded, to a rack of humming machines in a basement office, grainy black and white on time-lapse loops. The lobby camera showed Colette checking in at 6:14 p.m. Friday, signing the register, taking her key, disappearing into the elevator with a garment bag over her arm and a smile for the desk clerk. It never showed her leaving, not through the lobby, not through any monitored door. The elevator camera caught her going up at 6:16 and never caught her coming down. The service entrance the dogs had followed her to had no camera at all, a blind spot the hotel had been meaning to fix for years and, as these things go, never had. Reyes worked the case for 8 months, longer than he worked anything else that year, longer than the caseload allowed. He chased every lead to the same dead end. There was no ransom demand, no body, no confirmed sighting, no motive that survived contact with the facts. He interviewed Colette's mother until she couldn't answer anymore. He interviewed Ronan twice. He drove to the Rushmont at odd hours and stood in room 407 and tried, and failed, to imagine a version of that night that made sense. Then his retirement came, and a younger detective inherited the file, and inherited less of the ache. And the file thinned in the way files do when the person carrying them stops carrying. Julian Aldous remarried within 3 years and moved to another state, and by all accounts, spent the rest of his life as the man people whispered about at parties. That's the one whose bride ran off. Can you imagine? The bridesmaids grew up, married, moved away, stopped talking about it because there was nothing left to say. The Rushmont changed hands twice, renovated its lobby, added a rooftop bar, and buried the whole sad season under new carpet and better lighting. Colette Vane had vanished without a trace, and the case quickly went cold. Marcus Deal filed his tape Vane/Aldous rehearsal Eve on the steel shelf under V, and tried not to think about it. He did not succeed. 14 years is a long time to carry a locked room in your head. Ronan came home for the searches and stayed 6 weeks. Took leave he couldn't afford, and then unpaid leave he really couldn't afford. And walked the riverbank every day with a broken branch in his hand. Turning over leaves, looking under things, as if his sister might be found beneath a wet log if only he looked hard enough. He learned the search grids. He learned the names of the divers. He learned to read the particular tightness in a detective's face that meant we have nothing new. When the case went cold, he kept calling. He called Reyes once a month, then once a week when he was drinking, apologizing each time for calling. When Reyes retired, Ronan called the new detective, who was polite and then clipped and then hard to reach. Eventually, the number he'd been calling for years belonged to no one. Reassigned, disconnected, a stranger telling him he had the wrong number for a case he could not put down. He built a website with a photo of her and a phone number that was his own. He printed flyers, hundreds of them, and put them up in truck stops from 3 states over, long after flyers meant anything, long after her face on a pole had stopped being news and become just weather. He kept a box. Everyone who loses someone this way keeps a box. His had the flyers, the news clippings, a cassette of her voice from an old answering machine that he could not bring himself to play and could not bring himself to erase. Every Sunday night at 9, whatever time it was wherever he was, he'd catch himself reaching for the phone. The body remembers a ritual longer than the mind accepts it's over. He'd have the phone in his hand before he understood why, and then he'd sit with it, and then he'd put it down. Their mother died in the winter of 2016. The certificate said heart failure. Ronan knew the truer word for it. She'd spent 5 years in the front room of the house on Fenwick Street, in the chair that faced the door, waiting, literally waiting. Physically, her whole body pointed at the possibility of the door opening. She kept Colette's room the way it had been. She kept a plate for her at holidays. And somewhere in the 5th year, she stopped, all at once, the way a clock stops, not winding down, but simply ceasing. And after that, there was very little of her left. She lasted a few more months out of habit. Then she was gone too. They buried her next to an empty plot she'd bought and paid for and marked years before. A small granite stone already carved with Colette's name and birth year, and a blank space where the second date would go. For when she comes home, she'd told Ronan when she showed him. Matter of fact, as if she were pointing out where she'd planted the tomatoes. So she'll have a place beside me. So she won't be anywhere strange. Ronan couldn't look at the stone at the funeral. He couldn't look at it for years. The blank space where the date should have been was the loudest thing he'd ever not been able to hear. The city moved on the way cities do. Colette became a story people told new residents, a bit of local color, a shiver on a slow news day. The teacher who ran off the night before her wedding left the dress and everything. Never a word since. Wasn't that something? The version with a villain in it required work. The version where she'd simply run was easy and required nothing. And so it was the one that lasted. It cost the tellers nothing. And it cost Ronan everything. And there was no way to stand in a grocery line and correct it. The Rushmont put in the rooftop bar and started doing engagement shoots up there. Couples backlit by the sunset over the tea-colored river, none of them knowing what lay 4 floors below and deeper. Ardenmore Elementary named a reading nook after her, a corner with a rug and a lamp and a little brass plate. The Colette Vane Reading Corner. And for a while, the teachers told the kids about the wonderful teacher it was named for. Then those teachers retired, one by one, and the new ones didn't know the story. And the brass plate became just a name, and the reason quietly went out of it like heat from a room with the door left open. Marcus Deal's business died slowly, the way all of them did. Couples wanted their weddings on phones now, edited by an app, posted before the cake was cut. By 2024, he was 64, mostly retired, running out the lease on the Delancey Street shop and trying to figure out what to do with 2,000 tapes no one would ever ask for. That was the year everything suddenly changed. It began with a death that had nothing to do with Colette at all. A woman named Harriet Sable passed away that spring, 81 years old, and her daughter came to Marcus's shop with a shoebox of the family's old VHS tapes. She wanted them digitized birthdays, a christening, her parents' 40th anniversary. Standard work. Marcus took the box and told her a week. Among the tapes was one that wasn't a Sable family tape at all. It was labeled, in Harriet's shaky cursive, Annie Recital and Other. But when Marcus loaded it and scrubbed through, the recital ran only 20 minutes, and after it came a long stretch of black, and after the black came something else entirely. Footage of a hotel room, a dress on a hanger, young women laughing over champagne. Marcus knew that room. Marcus had shot that room. His blood ran cold. It was his own footage, the vain rehearsal Eve tape or a copy of it. He didn't understand. He'd filed the original himself. It was still on the shelf under V. He'd checked over the years, more than once. So how had a dub of it ended up in a dead stranger's shoebox, mislabeled, buried after a child's dance recital? He called the Sable daughter. She had no idea. Her mother had never mentioned it. Harriet had worked as a housekeeping supervisor at the Rushmont Hotel for 30 years, she said, retired around 2013. Maybe it came from there? She didn't know why her mother would have it. Marcus sat with that for a long time. A hotel housekeeper. A copied tape of the missing brides last night, hidden inside a family recording, kept for over a decade by a woman who'd never come forward. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. Unless Harriet Sable had seen something on this tape that she was too afraid to hand to the police and too unable to destroy. So Marcus did the only thing he knew how to do. He watched it, frame by frame, the way he'd never watched it in 2011, because in 2011 it had just been B-roll of a happy girl on a happy night. The first pass, he saw nothing new. Colette and her friends, the champagne, the dress on its hanger. He'd stood in that corner with his camera on his shoulder, and he remembered it, or thought he did. He remembered a warm, ordinary evening, a happy girl, a good job well done. The memory was so smooth and so complete that it took him 3 days to understand it was mostly invention. He hadn't been remembering that night for 14 years. He'd been remembering a story about that night, worn comfortable by repetition, and the story had quietly replaced whatever had actually happened. That is what memory does. It is not a recording. It is a rumor you tell yourself. The tape was the recording. And the tape and the memory did not match. The second pass, he slowed it to half speed and made himself do the thing he'd never done in his entire career. He stopped watching the subject. He watched the edges of the frame instead. The parts of the room he'd been ignoring while he shot it, because his whole attention, his living human attention, had been a spotlight on Colette. This is the thing a camera does that a person never can. It sees everything, all at once, with the same flat, indifferent attention. The button in the corner as bright to it as the bride in the center. Marcus's eye had been on Colette. The lens had recorded the whole room, every inch of it, and filed the truth away in silver halide and magnetic tape, and waited 14 years for someone to bother looking. And there, in the background, against the far wall of the bridal suite, was the large gilt-framed mirror, the one he'd registered as furniture, the one he'd never looked at, not once, in 14 years of not looking. He made himself look now. The third pass, he zoomed in on the mirror's surface until the image dissolved into swimming. Grainy color, the pale, doubled reflection of the room, reversed, the lamps flaring into soft stars. It was almost too degraded to read. He nearly gave up twice. The trouble with a 14-year-old VHS dub is that it hides its secrets in noise. But he'd spent his life reading bad footage, and he was patient in the way only a man with nothing left to lose is patient. And on the third pass, at 8:52 p.m., by the tape's own time code burned into the corner, he saw it. Something moved in the mirror. He froze the frame, backed up, went one frame at a time, the little counter ticking. The door to the suite's adjoining room, a connecting door beside the mirror, a door Marcus had assumed, if he'd thought of it at all, was locked and dead like connecting doors always are eased open. Just a few inches. And in the reflection, in the dark gap of the doorway, a figure, a person, standing very still. the shape of a man, tall and narrow, one hand on the doorframe, not entering, just there, watching. For a moment, just long enough. In the foreground, bright and close and loud, Colette was laughing at something Beth had said. But her eyes, Marcus went back and watched it 10 times to be sure. Her eyes cut to the far wall for 1/2 second, to the connecting door, and her smile changed. It didn't fall. That was the thing that made the hair stand up on Marcus's arms. It didn't fall the way a smile falls when you see something wrong. It steadied. It set. The way your face sets when you decide, on purpose, in a room full of people who can't know, to keep smiling no matter what. She wasn't afraid. That was what the tape said, if you knew how to read a face. And Marcus had spent his life reading faces through a lens. She wasn't afraid of the person in the doorway. She knew them. And she was choosing, in that 1/2 second, to protect the moment, to keep her friends laughing, to keep the secret in the doorway a secret. Then the door in the mirror eased shut again, and Colette laughed louder than before, too loud, the laugh of someone covering a sound. And the moment folded itself back into an ordinary evening and disappeared. Marcus rewound it, played it, rewound it, 15 times, 20. He watched it until his eyes ached and the room went dark around him, and the only light was the swimming gray of the paused frame. There was a person in the connecting room, someone Colette had seen, someone she'd known, someone she had chosen deliberately not to react to in front of the people who loved her. The official timeline, the one the whole case had been built on, the one that put a runaway bride on a locked room stage, said Colette was alone that night, except for her 3 bridesmaids, who left at 10 and were accounted for. Nobody else, no visitors, a woman alone in a locked suite who somehow walked out of it into nothing. But the connecting room 408, Marcus would learn, when he called in a favor from a man who'd once done maintenance at the Rushmont and still had a friend in the front office room, 408 had been listed as vacant in the hotel's records for that entire week. Booked to no one, cleaned and closed, empty. Someone had been standing in an empty room in the dark, watching the bride through a connecting door, 4 hours before she vanished from a locked suite 1 wall away. And it had been on a tape, on a steel shelf, under the letter V. In a room Marcus walked past every single day, for 14 years. Marcus took the tape to the police. The detective who caught it was young, polite, and busy. She watched the footage twice, agreed the mirror showed something, and explained, kindly, all the reasons it wasn't much. The image was degraded. The figure was a smear of light. A connecting door opening didn't prove anything. Could have been a maid, a guest in the wrong room, a trick of the reflection. The case was 14 years cold. There was no body, no crime scene left to work, no living witnesses who'd want to revisit it. She'd file the tape, she'd note it. She was sorry, Marcus understood. He even agreed, mostly. A smear of light in a mirror was not a case. But he couldn't put it down, because he'd started to remember something. Not the night itself, his memory of the night was, he now understood, almost entirely wrong. A comfortable story he'd built to fill the space where the truth should have been. What he remembered was afterward. The searches, the scent trail that stopped in the alley, and a detail from the newspaper coverage that had lodged in him and never come loose. 3 weeks after Colette disappeared, another Ardmore tragedy had briefly shared the front page. A young man named Wren Sable Harriet Sable's son had died in a single car accident on the River Road. 24 years old. Drove off the embankment in the rain. The city had grieved him as a promising kid gone too soon. a second sadness in a hard autumn. No one had ever connected the two. Why would they? A missing bride and a car wreck 3 weeks apart. Different pages of the same bad season. Wren Sable, Harriet Sable, the housekeeper who'd kept the tape. Marcus felt the floor tilt. He should have taken it back to the police, he knew that. Instead, he did 14 years of the work they'd stopped doing at his kitchen table, with a tape and a legal pad, and a growing sense that he was walking towards something he didn't want to reach. He went back to the footage. Again, the way you press on a bruise. He isolated the audio. This time the camcorder's little onboard microphone had captured far more than anyone had ever realized. Layers of sound flattened together into what sounded at normal speed, like nothing but a party. He split the channels. He pulled the levels apart. He ran it through cleanup software his nephew installed on the old shop computer over a weekend. The kind of tool that hadn't existed in any usable form in 2011, under the champagne laughter, faint, buried. Right at the 8:52 mark, when the connecting door eased open in the mirror, there was a sound that wasn't the women. He cleaned it up as best he could, played it a dozen times through good headphones in the dark. A voice, male, young, low and cracked, pitched under the laughter so only the microphone would catch it, so only a machine listening 14 years later would ever hear. 2 words. Please, Colette. Not a demand, not a threat, not the voice of a man who'd come to take something, the voice of a man who'd come to say goodbye and couldn't make himself do it. A plea, thin and desperate and unbearably gentle, from the dark of an empty room to a woman getting married in the morning. Marcus took the headphones off and sat in the quiet a long time. He compared the smear of a figure in the mirror against the one grainy newspaper photo of Wren Sable he could find, a yearbook shot, a lanky kid with his mother's long face. He couldn't prove it, but he couldn't unsee it either. The height was right. The way the figure stood, shoulders curved inward, apologetic even in silhouette. And then Marcus remembered the last piece, the piece that had been in his own footage the whole time. Earlier in the tape, at 8:31, one of the bridesmaids had teased Colette about a name. He'd never paid attention to the words. He went back. He turned it up. And does Julia know you still keep in touch with Wren? Colette's answer, light deflecting. There's nothing to know. We grew up next door. That's all it ever was. That's all it ever was. Marcus sat in his dark kitchen and understood that it had been a great deal more than that. And that whatever it was had ended in a locked hotel room, and 3 weeks later, on a rain-slick embankment above the river. He drove to Ronan Vane's motel the next morning. Ronan had come back to town when the police called about the tape. The young detective had done that much, notified the family, and he was staying at a highway motel, unable to leave, unable to make himself go home. Marcus knocked on the door of room 12 with the tape in a plastic bag, and no idea how to say what he'd found. He didn't have to. Ronan took one look at his face and stepped back to let him in. Here is what the two of them pieced together, over 3 days, from the tape and the hotel's old records, and a box of letters that Harriet Sable's daughter finally admitted her mother had kept in a locked drawer until the day she died. Colette Vane and Wren Sable had grown up on the same street, 2 houses apart. The kind of childhood friends who become one shared person before they're old enough to know it. They'd loved each other quietly and completely for as long as either could remember. And they'd never once said it out loud, because that was the kind of love it was too big and too obvious to risk on words. Wren had left for the service at 18. Colette had stayed, gone to college, become a teacher. They wrote letters. They told themselves they were just friends. When Wren came home, changed and quieter, carrying things he wouldn't talk about. Colette was already engaged to Julian Aldous, a steady man, a safe man, a man who looked good on paper and had asked her at the right moment in her life. Wren didn't fight it. That wasn't who he was. He congratulated her. He meant it mostly. But the night before the wedding, he couldn't stay away. He'd gotten the connecting room 408, under a friend's name, paid cash, a housekeeper he knew from the neighborhood looking the other way because she was his mother, and she could tell her son was drowning. Harriet Sable let Wren into 408 that night, not to hurt anyone, but because she was afraid of what he'd do if he had nowhere to put the feeling. She thought he only wanted to look, to say goodbye through a door, to get it out of his system and go home. At 8:52, he'd opened the connecting door. Please, Colette. She'd seen him. She'd kept smiling for her friends. When they left at 10, she'd gone to him. They talked for 2 hours. This much Harriet knew, this much she wrote in the letters her daughter found in the locked drawer, because she'd stood in the hall the whole time, terrified. Her cleaning cart parked outside 408 as an alibi and an excuse. A 68-year-old woman pretending to restock towels at midnight, listening through a door to two people she loved take apart a life that hadn't happened yet. She heard the low rise and fall of it, the long silences. Once, crying, she couldn't tell whose. She heard her son's voice, the son who'd come home from the service, a stranger wearing her boy's face, sound for a little while like himself again. And she stood there and did not knock and did not interrupt, because some animal part of her understood that this was the last conversation her son would ever have that mattered. And she could not bring herself to end it, even to save them all. Colette told Wren she couldn't. She was getting married in the morning. She loved him. She finally said it, the words they'd saved their whole lives. But she'd made a promise. And there were 100 people coming. And her mother had spent her savings on a dress. And you couldn't just undo a thing like that at midnight. She told him to go home. She told him they'd figure it out later, some later that both of them knew would never come. And Wren, who had survived things he never named, who had come home hollowed out and holding on by a thread, took the thread and let it go. He didn't hurt her. That was the thing Marcus and Ronan had to understand before they understood anything else. Wren Sable never laid a hand on Colette Vane. He stepped back toward the window of room 408. 4 stories up. The same locked window that had baffled Detective Reyes, except 408's window opened onto a fire escape that the suites did not, and Colette, seeing what he meant to do, lunged to stop him. They went over together. It was an accident. Every reconstruction Marcus could build from the physical facts said so. 2 people at a high window, one trying to save the other, the wet iron of a fire escape, the dark. Harriet, in the hall, heard the sound and ran into 408 to find both of them gone and the window open to the rain. And then Harriet Sable made the choice that shaped the next 14 years. Her son was dead in the alley below. She could see him from the window, the terrible stillness of him. And beside him, Colette. Harriet was 68 years old, a widow, and Wren was all she had. In her grief and her panic, she did not see a tragedy. She saw a story that would be told about her boy, the man who killed the bride. She saw his name turned into the thing the city said in low voices for the rest of her life. So she cleaned. She moved Colette. God knows how a small woman, a service elevator, a laundry cart, the loading entrance with no camera, the alley where the scent trail would end, because Colette had been carried the last stretch, exactly as the K9 handler's instinct had told him. Harriet took Colette to the one place she was certain no one would look. a place only hotel staff knew existed. The sealed sub-basement cistern beneath the Rushmont, decommissioned in the 70s, its access hatch behind a false panel in the housekeeping storeroom. She went back up. She wiped 408. She closed the window. She washed the champagne glasses in the suite and set them upside down the way she'd seen the bride leave glasses. A housekeeper's eye for a housekeeper's detail. She made the bed. She turned the suite back into a locked room with a dress and a bag and a phone, so that when the world came looking, it would find an impossible absence instead of an unbearable truth. And 3 weeks later, when the grief and the guilt and the secret grew too large for her to hold, her son, already in the ground, under a stone that called him a good boy, taken too soon, she drove his memory down the river road in the rain and told herself a car accident was a kinder ending than the truth. Except she couldn't destroy the tape. She'd taken it from the hotel's dubbing setup. Marcus had left a copy with the front desk for the couple, standard practice. And Harriet had understood, with a housekeeper's instinct, that somewhere on that footage might be the one frame that told the truth. Her son in the mirror, at the door, the beginning of the end. She meant to destroy it. She never could. She buried it inside her granddaughter's recital tape instead and kept it locked away. A confession she couldn't make and couldn't burn until she died, and it floated up into the light by pure accident. One small detail. A figure in a mirror no one had ever thought to look at. They found Colette in the cistern in the spring of 2025. It took a court order, an old set of hotel blueprints, and 2 days with a crew who didn't fully believe what they were looking for until they broke through the false panel and found the sealed hatch, and below it, in the cold, dry dark, what remained of a young woman still wearing the plain gold locket her brother had given her when she turned 16. Ronan identified the locket. He couldn't do the rest. He didn't need to. There was no arrest because there was no one left to arrest. Harriet Sable had been dead a year. Wren had been dead 14. The man the whole city had quietly suspected, Julian Aldous, the charming groom who'd remarried and moved away, had never had anything to do with it at all. He learned the truth from a reporter's phone call and by every account, wept. Not for himself, but for the years he'd spent as a roomer. The county reclassified the case. Colette Vane no longer a runaway, no longer a mystery, accidental death, concealment of a body, a file closed with no one to answer for it, because the two people who might have were both under stones of their own. The city that had spent 14 years telling a story about a woman who abandoned her wedding had to learn a harder one, that she'd never left at all, that she'd been beneath their feet the whole time in a building they'd renovated twice, under a rooftop bar where people took their engagement photos. The reading nook at Ardenmore Elementary got her name back on the wall. And this time, the teachers made sure the new ones knew why. Ronan drove Marcus out to the river road one evening after it was over, to the embankment where Wren Sable had supposedly died in a wreck that never happened the way the papers said. They stood at the guardrail in the last of the light. "I keep thinking I should hate him," Ronan said. "The Sable kid, her mother, somebody. 14 years, and I don't have anybody to hate." Marcus didn't answer right away. He was thinking about the mirror, about how the answer had been in his own hands the entire time, filed on a shelf, labeled in his own handwriting, and how he'd looked at that footage a dozen times over the years and never once looked at the edges. How certain he'd been that he remembered that night. How wrong that certainty had been. "It was there," he finally said. "The whole time. I had it. I just never looked at the part of the picture I wasn't pointing at." "That's not your fault," Ronan said. "No," Marcus agreed. But it's the truth. And I think that's the part that'll stay with me. Not that somebody hid her. That nobody had to hide the answer very hard. We just weren't looking at it. Ronan gave the empty plot beside his mother's grave to Colette that autumn. 14 years after her mother bought it and labeled it for when she comes home, she finally did. There was no reunion. There was no reconciliation, no confession delivered through tears, no villain marched away in cuffs. There was only a brother and a stone and a name set right, and the long, cold comfort of finally knowing. We like to believe that the truth hides from us, that it's buried, sealed away, kept in the dark by people who mean us harm. Sometimes it is. But Colette Vane's truth wasn't hidden in any clever way. It sat on a steel shelf under the letter V for 14 years, in plain sight, in a room full of tapes, waiting for someone to look at the part of the picture no one was pointing the camera at. The people who vanish aren't always running away. Sometimes they never went anywhere at all. Sometimes they're right where we left them. And it's our own certainty, our comfortable, confident memory of how the night went that keeps us from seeing. Colette didn't abandon anyone. She stayed right up to the last second of her life, trying to keep a promise and then trying to save a friend. The story the city told about her was easier than the truth, and it lasted 14 years, and it was wrong in every way that mattered. The truth cannot stay buried forever, but it doesn't always claw its way out on its own. Sometimes it waits, patient and quiet, for one person to slow the tape down, to look at the mirror in the background, to admit they never really saw the night at all, and to have the courage to look again. In the end, the darkness didn't win by hiding the truth. It won for 14 years, simply because no one thought to look. And it lost the moment someone finally did.